Okay, so I've got my foam cut out now. I've got my 3 layers, and because I rough cut everything, I don't worry about exactly where the lines are going to be. I just want to get the general shape. The one thing I do make sure I do when I lay it out properly is I make sure that my biggest one, whichever one of the 3, is my middle piece. That way when I'm sanding, I don't have to sand too far in to make those lines match up. I can just sand them square and then do my sharpening and shaping, whichever. So the next thing I need to do is I need to figure out how long my core is going to be. Now for this one, I'm going to use this carbon fiber rod. And in our rule system, as with many rules for LARPs, you'll have a certain amount of distance that you have to have from the tip of your core to the end of the foam. Now in our system, it's 1 inch to 1.5 inch foam. Any more than that and your tip's just going to be floppy and look terrible. So I've kind of made the minimum so it can still have a good look. And then on the butt of the weapon, you want to have a little bit of distance there as well. So once I get that laid out, I'm going to grab my piece of chalk and I'm just going to mark off where I'm going to cut that off. Make sure I've got my 1.5 inches. Excellent, and I want to make sure I have at least 1 inch on my pommel, and that's where I'm going to cut it off, right there. Depending on what materials you're using, but fiberglass and carbon fiber, I tend to either you do it in a very well ventilated area or wear a mask, because the filings from anytime you're sanding or cutting carbon fiber or fiberglass can be very damaging to your lungs, so you want to make sure you do that safely. Both with fiberglass and with carbon fiber, I like to take it onto my sander and just round the edges, just to make sure I don't have any little bits that are going to give me slivers. Okay, so I've got my core cut out now and cut down to length, and I'm going to show you something that I do for swords. I don't usually do this for axes, but I think for this one, because I've got the point up there that might end up accidentally getting used to thrust somebody. Our particular game system doesn't allow thrusting, but just for safety's sake, if this was a sword, I would be doing this. What I do is I cut out a small piece of foam just to extend that core the same size, and then I take some Kevlar wrap and I glue that around there as well to hold that on as I'm preparing my core. That way what happens is if it does get thrusted or gets pushed on, it's not pushing right up against the hard edge of the core. It's got just that little bit of give to it, and it helps the life of the foam last longer on the tip, so they don't wear out quite so quickly on both ends. It just helps the glue stick to it a little bit. And I'm going to take my contact cement. Now I just take regular contact cement. I buy it in the 500 ml red cans. I think it's LePage's or something like that. Barge cement you can't get here in Canada, at least not anywhere that I've seen. Now I do know an excellent cosplayer that's got another glue that I want to try. It's an upholstery glue, but just regular contact cement works fine. And I put it in a 500 ml water bottle, and I poke a few holes in the tip, and it creates a really nice applicator. So after you use it, it just creates its own little seal so the glue doesn't dry out. So now what you need to do is you need to put the glue on both the Kevlar like so, on the tip of the shaft, and on the foam on all 4 sides. because you want that to stick really well. Doesn't take a lot of glue. Now if you have any glue sensitivity or anything like that, you're going to want to wear gloves. I find this stuff peels off my fingers pretty much like white glue. It doesn't bother me at all, but I would recommend wearing gloves because you don't want to get it on anything else. Okay, so that took about 5 minutes to dry, and it's good and solid now. So I'm going to take this, stick that on the end, take my Kevlar, and just wrap it around nice and tight. Just like that. So now that's got a little bit more firmness. It's not going to, it's got that squishy bit on the end, so it's going to have a little bit more durability. Once I've done that, I wrap the whole thing in the black hockey tape, or whatever color hockey tape, to give it a little bit better texture and adherence to the core. So once you've got your core taped and lined up, now I'm going to mark on the foam. I need to use the middle piece. I'm going to mark the middle piece out so I know where to cut my channel for my core to go. Now our game system doesn't have a minimum allowance for this type of weapon for a butt, but you want to make sure you have at least a half inch in there. And then most systems will also have a minimum allowance from the edge of your core to your striking surface. On a sword, of course, I need to make that either use a thinner core or use the make the blade a little wider, because you wouldn't have that minimum striking edge distance. But being as this is an axe and the hand is going to take up most of the handle, I don't need to worry about that as much. So I've got that lined up. So I'm just, chalk wasn't working so well. I just used a ballpoint pen and traced really carefully the position of the core. So once I have that out, now I can cut out that channel for the core to rest in. You want to cut this really accurate and really square, otherwise it's going to distort your handle or your blade. A good rule of thumb when it comes to saving scraps is don't save anything that's smaller than your hand. You'll just end up with bags and bags of excess foam. Sometimes strips like this are nice because if you cut them lengthwise, you can use them to make roots along stuff and do nice twisty things or guards on weapons. But yeah, anything smaller than your palm, you don't want to keep that. You just end up with too much stuff. There we go. So that is how the core is going to fit. Once I've got my channel cut out for my core, the next thing I like to do, particularly with axes, is I like to glue my core into my center panel. So what that requires is I need to put glue on both sides of the tape and glue on both sides of the channel on inside. Scrap piece of foam here just to spread that out nice and even. I haven't built myself a nice overhead camera rig yet, so I'm kind of doing this a bit from the side. And then same thing on your core. You want to make sure you're very thorough and get the whole thing coated on the sides, because you don't want any spots that aren't really well stuck. So I'll let that glue dry for about 5 minutes and then we'll stick it in. Alright, so my glue has dried now. Now here's where it gets a little bit tricky, because you want to make sure that your glue is not touching too soon, because if it does, Once it's stuck, it likes to be stuck. So I usually put my far tip in and bring it up and then slowly press my sides together to make sure that I've got good contact on there. So next, make sure you sort out your sides so you know which you're gluing to where, and then coat both sides with glue. Once you get the glue on there, take your bit of extra foam, your foam brush, and your spreader, and just make sure you've got glue on every bit of it there. You don't want to have anything that's not coated because it will pull apart. There we go. And fast forward time. Okay, so the glue is dry and it's ready to be put together. Now normally what I do is I lightly push them together and then use my rolling pin to get a really good seal. But my rolling pin seems to be missing, so I'm going to have to do this by hand, which is fine. The big thing is you want to make sure you get your pieces really well lined up, all the way top to bottom, and then you want to get some real good pressure on there, and push that glue so you get a really good contact all the way up. I apply quite a bit of pressure. And you don't have to hold it for very long, but you want to make sure you give it a good rub and make sure that whole contact surface sticks. There we go. Any spaces where I get little gaps where it doesn't stick, you can always just open that up a little bit, put a little bit of glue in there, wait till it dries, and then repress it together. So it's not a huge loss if you have any problems you have to fix afterwards. You just want to save yourself work for later. And then same thing, you want to make sure your pattern's lined up like that. Apply your glue, let it dry, and stick them together. So there are a few different ways to shape in a weapon. My preferred method is with my belt sander. But you can take, if you don't have a belt sander, you can take a knife and slowly carve in those edges to sharpen things and straighten things as you want to. You just want to be very careful because you're gonna have to do a lot of sanding if you're using a knife to get those edges to look really smooth like steel. It works great for when you're making a wood texture to be able to carve it, because then you can carve a little bit rougher and take those corners off and it looks like carved wood. For ancient weapons is fantastic, but for modern things, if you want a really smooth looking surface, the knife is not your best option. The other option is using a Dremel tool with a sanding bit, and you can do the same kind of thing. I like to do that for my wood texture more than a knife. You can also use that on the blade edges. You just want to make sure that you're keeping a really close and controlled grip on it, so you don't bounce and accidentally cut lines across your weapon or prop that you're making. For me, I like to use my belt sander. I find it way faster, and I get a lot of control to be able to shape those things in as I need to. So yeah, that's what I do. I also have a vacuum hooked up to my sander, so it helps keep dust down. As you can see, I get really nice smooth edges. You want to be careful not to get any jitter. You will put marks in it if you skip or lose your grip on it. But I round off the undersides, and I do all my shaping to get it roughed in. Then I'll show you how I use my Dremel to do some of the finer bits. When I'm sharpening weapons, I usually leave that the center layer fairly flat. It just helps to make a little softer impact surface when you leave the center layer a little bit flat. Get your smooth edge just so it's nice and formed there. Looks like a blade, but you don't want it too sharp. Otherwise, if you're using Plasti Dip or even latex, it can create an edge that can scrape the skin and cause injury, which people don't like in LARP, is to be injured. Okay, so I've got it basically roughed in here. As you can see, I've sharpened the blade. Looks good on both sides, and I've squared up my handle. Some of the areas that are difficult to get into, like the tight crevices, I'm going to clean up with my dremel. I'm going to sharpen this point as well as sharpen the back of the blade yet. Yeah, and then I'll do the wood texture on the grip. I'm going to rough it in first with my knife, and then I'll smooth it out with the Dremel, just so you can really see the difference of how that works. So when roughing in with a knife, or when carving with a knife, I tend to be as careful as I can to not overcut. So you can see how pretty quick, it doesn't take very long to get it round, or round enough that it feels comfortable in the hand. I like to make a nice firm line around the edge of my blade so that you can tell where the metal starts and the wood ends. So it's getting pretty round here. I'm not going to go too much more than that, but you can see how it's got real jagged edges. Once you sand that with sandpaper, it's going to smooth a lot of that out. Like I said, I'm going to use my Dremel, and I also need to reinforce this here once I get it all set up. So if you hook a weapon or a shield or something like that, you're not going to do damage to the foam. You got the leather that we're going to put in there to reinforce that. Okay, so now I'm going to hit this with the Dremel, and you'll see right away you get a much nicer, smoother finish with the Dremel, and much nicer control. By using different approaches with the tip of the sanding wheel, you can put wood grain in there, you can do more choppy motion and make it look more carved as well. So take some scrap foam and experiment. There's no right or wrong way to do it. This is art. So yeah, I'll finish getting this shaped in. And I want to do this tip here before I move ahead. When you're sharpening something with a Dremel, you really have to be careful to get your edges really nice and smooth, because it's nowhere near as nice and clean as the belt sander. So as you see, you can still get a sharpened edge, but it takes a little bit more time and a little bit more care to really make sure that that comes out balanced and anywhere even close to what you can do with the belt. So as you can see, the finish edge you get on something sanded with a Dremel is just not quite the same as what you can get with the belt sander. But it certainly works well enough for what we're doing here. And it'll look even better once I seal it up with some heat. Now, I'm not going to heat seal the blade yet of the axe because I still have to carve the wolf on it, but I can seal the handle, and then I know that's done and I can move on. If there's any gaps or cracks that I need to fill, then I can do that. Yeah, so this part I'm going to seal with fire because fire is fun. Just got to heat it up, close up those cells in the foam. It'll shrink up a little bit. Nice and sealed up. So I only have one little spot I'm not happy with right on this corner. I think I can just hit that with the Dremel and smooth that out. This is one of the gaps that I was talking about. Sometimes when you start sanding things, it reveals the flaws in the glue, where the glue didn't quite stick together. So I'm just going to inject a little bit of glue in there, let that dry, and then squeeze that together. Okay, and ready to go to the next step. I've got a piece of art that the customer wants put on the weapon, and the way I do that is I start by basically creating a stencil. So I'll print it out on my computer, make sure I get it to the right size. I'll email back and forth, make sure they're happy with the positioning, that sort of thing. And then I will cut that out and make a stencil out of this art. Now, it's not going to look up exactly the same as this when I'm done, but it's a good starting point. So yeah, we'll carve this out. Again, same rule applies. Just take your time and be very careful with your lines. Make sure you're not, ruining your stencil as you go. So I'm going to try a couple of different techniques and see which one looks the best. I'm going to do one and I'm going to heat it with a torch. I'm going to do another one, I'm going to heat it with my heat gun, and just see what gives me the best control and the best look. But before I do that, I need to transfer this onto my foam. Again, I'm just going to use chalk, and I'm just going to draw in those holes. Be careful when you're doing that you're drawing over the holes in a direction that's not going to tear the paper. So you're dragging with the direction of the holes. Just going in about a millimeter or two into the foam. Okay, looks like I got all my lines. So as you can see, that brings out really fine details in all the lines. I'm going to do another one, and I'm going to try it with the heat gun. I found that the torch just heated it a little bit too fast. And yeah, so we'll see how that goes and we'll compare. Takes a little longer with the heat gun as it runs a lower heat than the blowtorch. But it should give us a more controlled effect. So here's what we get with the heat gun as opposed to the torch. I'm definitely liking the heat gun a lot better as far as detail goes, but I want to try one more thing. I'm finding that for whatever reason, probably the intricacy of the design, I'm not getting quite the transfer quality that I want to get out of this one. So I'm going to do one with a ballpoint pen in this stencil, and I'm going to do a little bit more broad cutting just to open those gaps up a little bit more. So in a split second, I'll be right back. There we go, split second later, and this is definitely my favorite. So what I did with this one is I did my outline cuts, and then I did a bunch of little micro cuts inside all of the areas that I wanted to be darker, and that really helped bring out the definition of the design. So when I do the final one on the axe, I will definitely do that, and I'm just going to take my time. Now you got to remember, these tutorials always make things look easier than they actually are. I've done this sort of thing. I've been doing this for a number of years now. I've cut out many designs, many stencils. I've made many weapons. So, you know, what I do in a day, it might take you 3 or 4 days to do. But, you know, take your time, use practice pieces. Don't be afraid of experimenting or making a few mistakes, because it's the only way you're going to really learn to do this well. Okay, so I think I got it all marked in here. And what I'm doing is I'm making these little micro slices. I'm doing it in the grain that the wolf's hair would go. Kind of just, you know, bring a little bit more of an artistic touch to it, rather than just something that was, you know, blazoned on. The story of the character that's going to own this weapon is she got the weapon from a fallen foe and claimed it as her own, then carved the wolf into it as it was symbolic and meant a lot to her, so it would have been carved in the field. All right, let's heat this up. That looks absolutely fantastic. I am super happy with that. So what I'm going to do now is, she wanted the axe to look very battle worn and scarred up with nicks and age to it. We're going to quickly decorate that up. Okay, so this is a fairly simple process. What I do here, you basically get your hot iron nice and hot, basically to where you can draw directly into foam with it just by dragging it across. And then I just kind of, you know, visualize where some battle damage would be. You know, blocking swords with an axe is going to put nicks in the blade. You know, little things like that. You know, maybe some scrapes across it. I'm not going to distort my art at all there. But say if a streak came across there. Maybe a couple of nicks in the back here. And yeah, you can just kind of play around adding some battle damage to it and make it look like it's well worn. There we go. So now it's got some battle damage, and we're ready for the next step. The next thing I need to do is I need to reinforce this axe head. As you can see, even just pulling on this a little bit lightly, it gets some flex to it. I want to reinforce that so if it does hook on anything, then it's going to have a little bit more stability. There we go. Doesn't have to be anything too deep. You just want it deep enough that that leather is going to sit down there and not be as obtrusive visually once everything's latexed and painted. Just so it's a little bit recessed like that. And then I soak my leather surface with contact cement. Try and mark that off. And then the same with the inner surface of the foam. Get that good and saturated on the surface. For certain weapons, I've even gone so far as to install the leather, and depending on the look of the weapon that I'm going for, I've installed the leather and then put more foam over top just to make sure that it's really discreet. Whereas this, because it's a little bit more of that deliberately rugged look, battle worn and everything else, having that little bit of a different material appearance is actually going to add to the uniqueness of the weapon. So I'll let that dry in there, and then I'll stick my leather in. Alright, and I'm just going to lay my leather piece in that little channel. Work it really nice and tight into that corner. It's got lots of support and lots of pressure down onto that glue, and it'll stay on there real nice. There we go. So that's how it looks once it's inset into the leather. When it's latexed, you won't even notice it. It'll be just completely invisible. If you're really paying attention, you know it's there. You might notice it, but it's just going to seem like a function of the weapon. And that's going to provide a lot more stability to that axe head. Cool. I'm excited. This is looking really good. I'm super happy with this so far.